That's my background.
Well, this is
my
looking.
first time on Zoom.
Yeah. Okay. So, hi everybody. I guess people are gonna roll in a little bit, but I wanted to start by just introducing myself. My name's Fritz Swanson, and I teach at the University of Michigan. But it's worth upfront de-credentialing myself. My degree is in fiction writing, so take everything with a grain of salt. I have a master's degree in fiction writing from 2001.
Cool.
But I bought my first press in 2005. My father's best friend had been a letterpress printer and a farmer. And when I was a very little boy, when letterpress was just on its way out in about 84, 85, I was at my father's friend's house, and they were fixing a tractor, and there was a C&P in the barn that he had just moved out of his old print shop that he had worked at. He had bought it from the owner of that operation. And that was the first press I'd ever seen. And so in the background of everything else I was doing, I was really interested in print technology. So I'm an avowed amateur, but since 2005, running a small print shop in my basement as a hobby, I started printing things for campus. And so now I run a letterpress studio on the University of Michigan campus called Wolverine Press. And the focus for Wolverine Press is teaching other creative writers, fiction writers and poets primarily, but also some English PhD students about printing history, printing technology. Much of this work is done in art schools, and people with art backgrounds kind of hold the keys to the academic side of this work. And so we're really proud that we focus almost exclusively on training writers how to work with presses and type. And that's kind of why metal type is a particular interest of mine, because we set long pieces. Every year we're setting poems and selections from novels. The longest piece we set a whole short story, 2,300 words. We had to have type specially cast for the project. And we do it all letter by letter. So we have a lot of experience, and I have now a fair amount of experience, both with the practice and the history of typesetting. But again, it's worth underlining, it's not my training, either academically or professionally. But that's a lot of people in the letterpress world are like that, who come up through events like this. Through, oh, we got a looper.
Hang on, I think what's happening is, John, I think you have your audio on your computer and your phone on. If you could mute one of those.
Just turning it off here.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. And so that's kind of my background, such as it is. And please, anybody who sees anything that they have a question about or have a different view on, let me know as we're doing it, because I have the way that I do things and what I've learned, but it doesn't come from any specific academic tradition, even though I know people who've come up and have had serious training in that way. Before we go any further, though, I kind of want to know who you guys are. And if we could just, I guess I'll call your name. And then if you could tell me just quickly where you're located and just kind of roughly your experience with letterpress. And if we could do it quickly, we can move through everybody and I'll get a sense of who I am talking to. So Dory, why don't you start? Where are you at and what's your experience level?
Sure. So I'm Dory Boone. I'm in the Houston area. Actually, I'm in Houston proper. And I have mostly had experience with large type. So setting small, tiny type is brand new to me and I'm really bad at it, which is why I requested this class, because I recently got 2 tabletop platen presses that I'm interested in doing some work on, and I found that I just don't currently have that skill. So.
All right, perfect. Dawn. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Dawn next.
So I'm completely new to letterpress. I've taken a few classes. I actually twisted somebody's arm and I'm buying their C&P here in Arizona. So as soon as this virus stuff lets up, I'll be picking that up. But besides taking a couple classes, I actually teach digital printing at our local high school. So I'm a trader. They don't know that yet. and I do yearbook and photography and stuff like that at our school. So brand new.
Wonderful. Now I'm just going by what is on my screen. I see Mitchell. Is that correct?
Yes. Mitchell Ahern here in Lynn, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. I have my own print shop here at my house in the garage. I'm a volunteer staff at the Museum of Printing in Haverhill. I also print out of Flower City Book Arts in Rochester, New York. And I buy, sell, and restore Golding presses.
Okay, great. William Whitley.
Yes, I started printing in the late 60s when I worked my way through college in a print shop. And I've been collecting presses on and off ever since. I currently have the standard setup of everyone, which is a C&P and a Vandercook. I mean, I like printing with lead type metal. I've used some polymer, but it's not as interesting as setting type by hand. In fact, setting type is half the fun. And I'm here to hear what other people are doing and how you're doing it.
Okay, very good. Amy Town.
I'm unmuted, okay. Hi, Amy here. I run Town Press out of my house in Bellingham, Massachusetts. We mainly do a lot of wedding stuff, so it's mainly all like digital design and photopolymer plates. My husband does most of the typesetting. Yeah, my husband does most of the typesetting around here, so I'm looking to kind of up my skills here.
Okay, great. John, again, real quick. John Drew.
John Drew, I'm in Minneapolis, and I've been printing for ever since high school, and so I'm getting the.
This is life now.
Hey, John, if you can hear us, I think we lost you. You might have some connectivity issues.
Yeah, so press pause on that, John. I'm going to move to the next person just so we can keep rolling. So it's Chloe Sosa-Jarrett.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chloe. I am in Hackensack, New Jersey, if anyone knows where that is. My experience is mostly with photopolymer plates. I usually print on a Vandercook because I'm really spoiled, but I was happy and very lucky to acquire a Craftsman Superior yesterday.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, yesterday. I had a really long drive. I drove to New Hampshire and back in one day, and so I'm a little tired. This is the only thing I've ever printed with type. So it's literally right here in my hands, and I want to get better. I mostly do wedding stationery, so I stick with the polymer plates, but who knows, maybe somebody will want something a lot more time consuming and fun to create.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, Erin Kenny.
Hey everybody, my name's Erin. I'm in Chicago. I have several presses in various stages of function. I am very new at this. I've taken a few classes with Paul Aiken up in Zion, and yeah, I'm just here to learn.
Okay, great, thank you. And Kelsey Smith.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I have a new computer. I'm still figuring it out. I am Kelsey. I live in Olympia, Washington, and I help run Community Print, which is a community letterpress shop that's been going in Olympia for over 20 years. We have Vandercook Proof Press. We have a Corex press, electric press. And we have a little Gordon jobber that's kind of needing some repairs. And it's nice to meet you all. Oh, and I'm a librarian. This is my hobby.
All right. Great. Well, well, first of all, Dory, is there anyone else? This is it. This is everybody we got right now?
We have 20 folks on, and it looks like on my screen we have Anna, Pablo, and Emma, and Adam, who may not have said hello yet. I think
Okay.
right.
I just have whatever 9 on my screen right now.
Oh, yeah, we have a lot of people watching, Fritz. Anna, would you mind introducing yourself?
Not at all, although Fritz knows me. Hi,
Hi, Anna.
Fritz, if you click gallery view up in the corner, the opposite probably from what I'm saying, you can see all of us. So in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I'm a graduate student here at the university in classical studies, and have fallen into love for letterpress, and have been lucky to be learning from Fritz a little at the Wolverine Press and partake here in a local, like the Ann Arbor District Library workshops, or just, you know, free time to play around on Wednesdays. But I miss it because we can't do that right now. So I figured I'd join here and learn and have some community.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah. And in fact, Dory, apparently my iPad doesn't allow me to see everybody.
No worries.
So if you could ask a few more people.
Yeah, Pablo, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I'm Pablo. I'm a graphic designer from Argentina, Neuquén, Argentina, the south. And I own a small workshop where I set type. I'm learning, and I do some bookbinding too. I own a Heidelberg windmill from 1927 with no register, and another press that I don't know its name.
Wonderful, thank you. Emma Schwartz.
Hi, I live in Portland, Oregon, and I just moved here from Maine. I have a very, very tiny business that's just myself called Squeezebox Press, and I only own a small platen press, like a tabletop press, but I use other people's larger presses, and I volunteer at a local community print shop called the IPRC that's really great. And I feel like I was really lucky to learn typesetting and printing in college, but I just feel like there's always more and more tricks to learn, so I was excited to just tune in.
Thank you. Adam Burley?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, just barely.
My name's Adam. I am new to letterpress. I own a little 5x8 Kelsey that I still have yet to use, but I've ran multiple different machines, basically Klugis, not letterpress, but foil stamping, embossing, die cutting, and been doing that for about 12 years in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Thanks, Adam. John, you want to give it another shot?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, John Drew, I'm in Minneapolis. I've been letterpress printing since 7th grade, and I have I have a shop with about 4 or 5 or 6 tabletop presses, 8x12 C&P, an old guillotine, 2 pearls, a couple hundred cases
online letterpress type.
And so anyway, I just did want to see how this class goes and see what kind of tips other people have. I'm self-taught in a way, and so there's always so much more to learn from Fritz and Pablo and everybody else out there.
Thank you. Renee? Renee Roby, maybe?
Yes. Actually, my father we're from Indiana, and I'm just watching this with him. He's shy, and he does this as a hobby. He used to be a machinist. He has several presses. I know there's a Chandler and Price. I know enough to be dangerous, but he really enjoyed your group on Facebook and asked me to help him hook up on this so he could learn a little bit more too.
Well, welcome. We're happy to have you guys. Hallie?
Hi, my name's Haley. I am in about 45 minutes north of Atlanta, Georgia. For a time, I did do some letterpress business stuff, but my degree is from SCAD and graphic design and bookbinding arts. My journey with letterpress is kind of a long one, so I'll just give you guys the super short version. I'm from a very small South Georgia town, or it's much bigger than it used to be, but there was a living museum that was there through my childhood. And so for elementary school, we would take field trips there, and there was a working print shop there. So when I was about 7, I was introduced to typesetting letterpress, and I guess I've been following it around and ever since. I have a garage print shop where I have a couple different kinds of presses. I have some CMPs, I have a Vandercook, and I have a Kluge. So hi, everybody.
Thank you. Fritz, I think we have 3 more folks. Steph? Steph may just be listening. Katie Prescott? Okay, and Parker. Do we have Parker? Okay, I think that's it.
That's fine.
They may introduce themselves later.
Well, and what's important to me about that is finding out where everybody's coming from. You've got, as you can see, a quite wide range of skill levels and connections to the craft. And that's really typical in letterpress across the country. People, you know, I've worked with a lot of different printers from a lot of different backgrounds. And I remember Theo Rehak, who was a typecaster, now retired, in New Jersey, he once said to me, you know, everything in this shop, everything you do, every task you take on, that could have been some guy's life's work. That everything that happens in a print shop at one time was in such a state of industrialized excess that was like one guy who would like take care of this thing, and one guy, you know, one guy's operating the press, and one guy's doing the typesetting, and one guy's working at the stone. You know, you got kids doing their distro work, and in small shops, you know, you would cross-train and you would do little bits of this and that. But in larger industrial settings, you could end up with somebody who had spent 60 years kind of working in one little corner of that space. That would have been true in printer operations, but also true in typecasting operations. And so every one of us, to one degree or another, is an amateur. You know, you can be a 10-year amateur or a 20-year amateur or a 50-year amateur. But when you go back in time and you look at the way that the old printers, the kind of work that they did, it's hard to compare ourselves. The thing I tell my students is that in the 19th century, typesetting was such a huge industrial task. And trust me, I could talk for quite a long time about the intense culture of typesetters in the 19th century. But the average typesetter could set type at about 25 to 35 characters per minute, which is an intense speed. And that the fastest typesetter who ever lived that we know of was a man named George the Velocipede Arensberg. He could set type, he set it competitively in typesetting races. He set type at 75 characters per minute, which gets close to like the low end of typing speed. Now, I've been setting type, obviously, as a hobby and as a small part of my teaching job for 15 years now. I can set at about 11 characters per minute. And I can train students to get from 3 characters per minute to maybe 9 characters per minute, right? And so when I think about skill level today and skill level then, even today when people have set type and they've done it professionally, you know, they've done it in shops that have had industrial typesetting machines like Linotypes and Monotypes and Ludlows. And so they just were never put in a position to just set a chapter of a book and do it for money. Like they've never been in a position to set at speed and to set in quantity. And so when you look back in the old books about, oh, this is how you typeset, you always have to like put a bracket around that and realize that that was an industrial reality where kids were learning to typeset when they were 11 and then typesetting their entire lives. And we just don't live in that world. Even the very best typesetters today don't live in that world. And so I always try to bracket whatever is like traditional, quote unquote, with what works in different contexts. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you a couple of, first of all, the basics of a piece of type, and then two different typesetting techniques. One of them that is traditional and one of them that I've come up with on my own, or sort of I utilize in my own shops. And I'll talk about their differences and their uses, and you can, you take from it what you'd like. So first of all, I wanted to introduce you to a piece of type. And I know that for those of you who've been typesetting for a little while, this will be a little bit of refresher. For those of you that are really just getting into it, this will be new information, but we'll kind of move through it in that way. So let me flip my camera around. All right, make sure we got, so this is a piece of type, all right? And I'm trying to hold it so you can see it. All right, so we're looking at it from the side. I think this is a 30-point A with the light on it. Can you see the A? Yeah, all right. So, in my video camera, I could focus more easily, but I can't get this to focus as easily. So I'll hold it back a little bit further. So the first thing to note is the letter itself is the surface that you're going to print on, and that's the type face. To get into a little bit of technical notation, there's no such thing as a font the way that we use that word today. It's a face, a type face, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that, but this is what it literally means. It's that flat relief surface that the A, it gets covered in ink, it gets pressed into the paper. That is the letter that presses. That's letterpress, right? That face is the only thing that needs to get ink on it. Everything else you got to avoid. And when we talk about that in the shop, we'll talk about the face, got to have ink on it. And then there's this metal that's down below the face. You can see that the face actually sits up a little bit above the metal. I don't know if is that in focus enough for you to see that the letter sits up higher? Anna's shaking her head.
I mean, you can see it, but it's not in focus, if that's what you mean.
It's not in focus, but you can get the idea of it, right?
Fritz, if you put your other hand behind it, it sometimes helps bring that into focus. Sometimes. It might be a little too close, but. There.
I think that's... okay.
We have some lighting issues too.
Yeah. I think we understand what's happening though.
Okay. So the issue is around the face is a rectangle of metal. I'm going to hold it still. And that rectangle of metal is often called the shoulder of the type. Okay. And the first thing is that when you're setting a piece of type like this is one of the distinctions between metal type and wood type, is wood type sometimes doesn't have as much of a shoulder. The letter form will fill up more of that space, and you want to keep your ink off of that shoulder. But it's also useful because the shoulder of the type is where, if you've got a kerned character, like lowercase f, the end of that kerned character will set on the shoulder of the type next to it, okay? So you've got the face, you've got the shoulder, and then you've got this, the vertical distance is called the body or the shank, and the height of that is precise, right? It's 0.918 inches. On the belly of the body, you've got this groove. It's called the nick. And the nick is pretty important. And when we get to setting into a stick, we'll see what the nick is for. But the basic thing the nick does is it tells you which way is up on the letter, right? You could imagine this could be a V, right? Or an A. Obviously the cross piece tells you that it's an A rather than a V, but the nick also does. The nick sets the baseline. So with the nick, you know which way the type is supposed to go. And this is important when you're looking at like a B or a P, when you're sorting through your type and you're setting something. If you've got a P in your hand, the nick is going to be on one side. If you've got the letter B, lowercase, it's going to be on the other. U's and N's often look the same or very close to the same in a set of type. You're going to use that nick. And when you're setting, you can feel the nick as well as see the nick, and that's why it's so beneficial. And then the bottom of the type is the foot. One of the important historical features of type is that sometimes all of these elements are used to describe the piece of type as a little man or a soldier, right? It's got a face, it's got a shoulder, it's got a body, it's got a belly, and it's got a foot. And the old printers would sometimes say that they were sending their soldiers into battle when they were setting type. All right, so I'm gonna come around now and I'm gonna get a type stick. All right, I'm gonna get this type stick. So, all right. Should I stand on the other side of the camera? Okay, I think I'm good. So this is a type stick. And in traditional typesetting, the type stick has both the stick itself, which is like a tray. And forgive me, I wonder if somebody could tell me, I can't remember if this piece here, I believe it's called the heel. Is it called the heel or the foot? Anyways, there's a movable piece here that is set in, that sets the edge or the boundary of your typesetting line. And when you're setting type, you have to set it on a piece of metal that's called leading, or it's called a strip. And that piece defines the length of your line. All right? So before you make any other decisions, you usually want to decide what your line length is going to be, sometimes called the measure, because you want to make sure, A, that that line length is going to be appropriate for the form you're setting, right? Is that going to be a measure that's going to be useful on the paper you're going to print on? Is it going to be pleasing according to the size of the type and the design of the type that you want to use, right? So picking that measure is significant for aesthetics. You often don't think about the measure because when you're using, like InDesign, it's just a bounding box around your letter forms, and you grab the corner of that bounding box and you just drag it around, and you can change the length of the line and therefore the shape and duration of the column of text. But you can't do that. Once you start setting, you kind of have to stick to the line that you've chosen. So you have to make those decisions up front. So in addition to having the aesthetic material decisions, you also have to make sure that you've got enough of these. Now in an old print shop, you would probably be buying these in 2-foot lengths, and then cutting them to a particular purpose. And in newer print shops too, if you've got good supplies, you'll have these in 2-foot lengths and you'll be cutting them to a particular purpose. But I often find in people's print shops, they'll end up with the lead slugs that they've got. Mm-hmm. You'll have however many you got. It'll be difficult for you to get new ones. And so like in Wolverine Press, when we're deciding on a project, we can cut more slugs, but I often like to just go to the case, figure out how many of these we got in a particular length, and then make a guess as to how many lines we're going to need to set and use what we already have rather than cutting new, because getting new slugs is itself challenging. These are measured in pica measurements. And so you'll set it here in the stick, and you can see up here, well, you know that there are numbers there. Again, focusing in this situation is difficult. But this is all measured out in pica measurements, and then you'll bring this heel up and you'll lock it in place, and then you're ready to set type.
Fritz, I think there's a question about how to loosen up your, what's that little thing called again? The type stick. So if it's a little bit sticky, do you use oil on it or something else? How do you clean it up and make it a little looser?
So you have a type stick, is the premise of this question?
Yes.
And it probably has a different kind of mechanism on this side than what I have.
I don't know the answer. Somebody said that maybe whoever asked the question could ask it aloud.
Hi, sorry, my mouth was full. I think I have the same one as you. It looks very similar to what you have. We've got other ones that it's just hard to adjust the length of the stick.
Yeah. What were you saying, William?
John has a micrometer stick.
Do you have one?
I have a couple of them. They're very handy because you can do it in less than a point increments.
Yeah, there are a number of different kinds of these. And some of them, the reason why I ask, it really depends on the stick. Some of them have a dial that moves kind of like a micrometer, will move very, very precisely. This one, you can see, it has these precisely cut holes, and then I'm just going to call it a heel. This piece has some teeth on it, and they sit down in that hole and lock into place. And so you'll set it by the increment, moving it up and down, and then you'll close it. It also has a little lever here that's inside, and you can turn that lever to move it tiny little increments within the range where it's been set down. That's kind of precise. As far as oiling it, I don't see any particular reason why you couldn't oil the moving pieces. It's not coming into contact with, the main reason that you kind of don't want to get into oil in these situations is if you're going to be using the piece in the context of paper and like moving your hands back and forth between this and that. But typesetting is already dirty enough that I can't imagine that adding a little bit of oil to the stick is going to make a problem. And you're not actually printing at this stage, so you can clean your hands and clean everything up. So yeah, I would imagine oil on the moving parts, you know, like the hinge here, things like that would be beneficial to its operation. Obviously, if anybody has any more direct experience, let me know. This is my nicest, cleanest one. This one's probably not more than 30 or 40 years old. It's been kept in very good shape, but I have some pretty rusty ones that have been in less ideal conditions, and yeah, I've oiled them, and I haven't had any ill effects from that.
If you can find a stainless steel stick, you're ahead of the game. I have a number of sticks that have rust on them, and they never clean up well enough. I suppose you'd want to use oil or something like that, but I tend to stay away from oil when at all possible. You don't want to get on your fingers.
I found one at a local thrift shop before this all happened. I'm very lucky. They had no clue what it was. Just marked micrometer because that's what it said on there. I use some rubbing alcohol or like isopropyl alcohol with a Q-tip first to just sort of clean it. So if it's sticky because it's gotten grody, then it might be sticky because of that. Then if it's still sticky after it's clean, I would use some oil, as Fritz said.
But yeah, there isn't a mechanical reason not to do it, but there could be cleanliness reasons not to do it. That would be the thing, depending on your circumstances. All right, so the next part of this, I'm going to move to the other side of this, and you can tell me if I've been, am I enough in frame for you to see what I'm doing here with my hands?
Very good.
See your shoulder and your hands.
Okay. And you can see my hands then, right?
Yes.
And I'll bring it around. I'm just going to pull some letters up. I've been setting the bells on Christmas Day, because you have to get your Christmas stuff set early these days, right? And I've been setting on a 25 pica measure, and I'm starting the second to last stanza. And so here we've got our type case. And actually, before I start setting, I might give a little bit of an introduction to the type case for those of you who aren't familiar. Can you see the type case?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a California job case. It is a composite type case from the 1870s. So virtually all the type cases you're going to run into today in America are going to be California job cases. There are a couple of other specialized cases. These aren't the sort of long ago traditional type cases. They are an innovation at the end of the 19th century. After the linotype took over, these cases became very popular. You've got basically three main sections in the case. These two on the left are for the lower case, and then this one quadrant, this third here on the right is for the upper case. Now, even as I use that language, you probably have an indication as to how case design worked before the California job case. It used to be that just these two parts were a case by themselves, and then the uppercase section was its own separate case with 2 units of its own that set above. And so you would, when you were organizing your cabinets, you would have your lowercase below your uppercase. Obviously, that joke continues all the way through. But today, quote unquote today, by the 1870s, they didn't need as much type to set long form material. And so they went to this composite case or jobbing case because it had enough material in it to set short projects, to set letterheads, business cards, what was called job printing. And so you get this composite case. So the lowercase section is not organized alphabetically. It's organized by usage. So we've got T here, H here, and E here. This middle bar here would have been the center of the original old style lowercase. And so THE in English is the most common letter cluster. And so you've got it right there in the middle. And then you've got your A, your O, your I, your R, your S. Right here clustered around the middle of this case are your commonly used letters. And you can see here the E, it's the biggest box in the case because it is the most common letter. So the case is reflective of letter distribution patterns that have been studied by printers going all the way back to the 1500s. You know, you get out here into the corner, this lower left corner is Q, you've got X and Z. You know, as you get further from the center of the case, I know the case pretty well in the middle. As you get to the edges, I start to get a little dicey as to whether I remember it. And then over on your far right, you've got the uppercase, again, quote unquote, and it by and large is organized alphabetically, except J and U come at the end. I wonder, can anybody tell me why J and U come in after Z?
I can.
I know you can, Anna.
I think I can. Is it
Why?
because they didn't enter the English language till after, like, Gutenberg or something? I think that's
true, yeah. So the J and the I, for example, weren't differentiated in English dictionaries until the 19th century. It was Noah Webster that differentiated them. The U, the V, and the W were all intermingled as letter forms going all the way up into the 18th century. And it speaks to the antiquity of this design, that J and U came along way late in the game, and as a consequence, they just got thrown in at the end. One of the things I think that is really interesting, again, for all of us to think about when we're doing printing is when people ask us what we do, you say, oh, well, we're doing old-time printing, or you're doing historic letterpress printing. And you have to remember that historic or old-time are in just a dozen quote marks because it's a 500-year history. It has no single moment that represents it. And to think of it as a kind of static old-time thing diminishes it, right? It's half a millennium of human ingenuity and development go into this process. And so you have to be humble. You're just never going to have a full mastery of it all. I guess part of what I always do is to remain humble in the face of all this stuff. All right, so that's the case. So we're setting our type here, and I'm going to set just the very beginning of this. And all right, can you see my hand?
Yes.
All right. So as I'm drawing my letter out, first of all, I'm making sure that I've got the right letter, that I pulled it from the right box, and that I'm looking at the nick. In this case, this ATF type has 3 nicks on it, but the nicks are there all on the baseline, and I set it with the nick up. So the very first thing that I've set is the first A, because the first line is, and in despair, I bowed my head. So I'm starting with my capital A, and I've set it upside down. The nick is up so that the top of the A is pointing down. Most of this is a radio show at this point, I guess. But that way, even though it's upside down, because the letters are all backwards, I can still read it from left to right. And it turns out reading from left to right is much more deeply hardwired into us than the shape or the orientation of the letter. So having it upside down and backwards isn't a problem as long as I get that left to right reading experience. All right, so I'm gonna hold it more correctly this time. So you've got your hand around it. Your hand is kind of clawed up like this with the stick is sitting on your palm. All right, can you see this?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great. And your thumb is coming down and holding the type. Now I'm setting at 14 points, so that's a little bit of a reach for me. Depending on your hand size, sticks are going to be more or less comfortable. Another feature of the historicity of letterpress printing, obviously, is that all the equipment was made for like 19th century men. So God has blessed us with a diversity of bodies, and we don't all fit with the way that the 19th century printers wanted us to fit. So we've got our A, and then we've got our N, and we've got our D. And as I think about printing, and I'm holding that line with the tip of my thumb, and then I'm going to set my first space. So I often think about setting as a word and then a space. That's the unit that I use in my head. Of course, I often do my typesetting these days in demos like this, so I'm also extremely slow, even slower than 11 characters per minute. Once I've got my space set, then I can go to my next word. In this case, it's in, so I'll grab my I, and I'll grab my N, and I'll grab my space. And again, what's important to me is that once I've set my space, then I feel like I'm done. Depending on the way you're setting your type, that becomes more or less important. As you set through the line, so I'm going to the next one, despair. Obviously, the words will get a little longer. And now I'm focusing. Testing my own memory of where all the letters are. I've got my chart up there, but I'm trying not to look. So again, as these words get longer, I find that it's productive. This is my cat, Loki. Can everybody see Loki? He knows I'm down here. And so he wants to say hello. All right, so yeah, with despair, right? I hold myself until I get to that space. All right, I'm gonna come around to this side so that I can see if you can see a little bit better what I'm doing here. I don't know was it better that way or this way?
You can see more detail this way.
Yeah, okay. And you can see here, I'm holding it with that thumb, and that's keeping everything kind of situated. Holding with the thumb, and also I'm tilting it. You know, I have it not flat and not upright. Like if I have it upright, it all falls out the front. Mm-hmm. If I have it flat, then the letters tend to fall over. So just kind of holding at a tilted angle like this with your thumb there keeps things organized as you're setting. Now I'm looking at my cat, wondering if he's safe. Come on, buddy, let's get down. All right. So let's see here. So one of the other things you're going to run into in a case is that there is no one space. There are a number of different spaces in the case. There are, do I have my, well, let me finish the line. Trying to decide which things I want to tell you. In fact, while I'm setting, maybe now's a good time for you guys to shout out some questions.
Make sure to remove your mute if you have a question. Otherwise, we won't be able to hear you.
I mean, if we're talking about spaces, what space do you use for the space between words and why? Because I struggle with that still.
Yeah, well, I bowed my head. So I'm going to set my, and then I'm going to tell you about spaces because I got lots of opinions about spaces.
Sounds like it'll be Fred's story time.
Yeah. All right. By the way, preparing for this is my basement shop, which used to be the main shop where I printed. But for the last 5 years, 6 years now, I've been at the university printing, and I have a big shop there. So almost everything that I thought was really interesting or useful, I had brought into the shop along with the stuff that the university had bought. And so in preparation for this demo, I went back into the shop and tried to get as many things out of there as I could possibly get. But every time I picked something up, I realized that in order to get that to work, I needed 5 other things. And eventually I had filled my entire car out. And so I'm standing here right now holding this stick, and my arm is getting tired. And I have this wonderful little wedge-shaped stand that I can set my stick in. But it is sitting in the shop in Ann Arbor, and it's not here. Which is not really very important, other than to say that there's just an infinite amount of stuff that you can get for a printing shop. All right, let me grab a couple of spaces here, and I will show you the different spaces, because I think this is significant. Let's see. The issue is that when you buy type, especially if you buy it from an old printer, you get a case of type like this, which for those of you who are getting into the craft, this is very common. This is exactly how I did it, and everybody's going to end up with it. You don't buy type new, and so you don't get all the parts in their separate packages. Instead, you get a case, and it's just full of stuff. And I find that the spacing material is the most confusing, because when you get it, it's just going to be a jumble. Because by the time a printer has used a case for a while, they'll have all of their spaces just kind of where they're going to put them. Some printers are very fastidious and keep all their spaces separated. Some printers, I find most printers are not that fastidious, and they have a kind of jumble of spaces. In fact, after I tell you about spaces, I'll ask all the old printers how fastidious they are about their spaces. But here, let me bring this around. And again, seeing these differences is really, really hard. I think right there at that angle.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got first this guy. He's called the M, E-M. And probably you're familiar with him, but just to define him precisely, he's a perfect square of the point size. So in this case, we've got a 14-point typeset, and this is a 14-point M. So he's 14 points high, but also 14 points wide. Now the M is the unit of measure in traditional printing. So in the 19th century, when you were, I'm actually going to try this. I think with these smaller pieces, I wonder if I can, ooh, that's a little bit better focus. Maybe I'll do it this way when I'm bringing stuff around here. All right, so the M was the unit of measure. It was the area measure. It was how you got paid. When you set type, you set it by the M, right? And so like when you measure out the area on a sheet of paper, then you would measure it in these M's. Now, obviously, what that meant is that if I set 30 M's in 14 point, and you set 30 M's in 36 point, right? The actual physical area by inches would be different, but the M area would be the same. And that was how they were able to rationalize that typesetting. They were able to pay the 14-point typesetter, the 9-point typesetter, the 36-point, the 72-point typesetter. They could pay them all the same rate because the actual physical action of picking out the letters and setting them in the page was the same. Didn't matter about the size. All right. So the other spaces that we've got, okay, let me see if I can do this, are fractions of an M. So the next space, and I'm going to try not to drop the rest of these letters, is this little guy. And Trying to get my focus here.
And focus, Fritz.
All right, this little guy is called the N, E-N, and he is exactly half of an M. So he's 14 points high, but in this case, he's 7 points wide, okay? Sometimes he's called the nut. So you'd set an M and a nut. Now, we don't use the N for very many. I mean, you can be very precise in your typesetting, and there are some places where the N is called for. But these two guys aren't used very much anymore. When I get to the end of my line of poetry, I'll have extra space on the measure after the letters, and I'll still need to fill that up with material. I'll use these guys to fill that space up. I've also got double M's in the case, which are twice the thickness of the M, and I can use those to fill the space up. And for most of you doing your first typesetting, you're going to use these at the ends of your lines just to hold everything together. There are some other technical uses for these, which I can mention in a second. But then, I did a lot of prep for this, by the way, and I'm still finding that there's like a series of things that I have not prepared for. For example, right now I would like a very tiny table to set my little spaces on right now. I don't have that, so I'm struggling in my hand here. And I've just lost a space, but that's okay. I've got the three that I need. So again here, that comes through. If I shift them slightly, you can see them. These are three different spaces. And the way that they're described is as a fraction of an M. So the thickest space is the 3 to M space. The middle one is the 4 to M space. And the thinnest is the 5 to M space. Does that make sense for everybody? Right? Now, I'll come back actually to a technical use of the M, because the question you might have is as you're setting your line, which space are you going to use? Obviously, you're not going to use this guy, right? That would look really weird. I hope you would. In fact, I would encourage everybody for their first typesetting, set with just the M quads as your spaces, and then print it, and you will understand. more than anything I could say, seeing it is really instructive, because sometimes with student compositions I see these sneak in and it's fascinating. But you still got these three guys, and then it's a real question of like, what are they for? When you're setting poetry, well, okay. When you're setting poetry, you usually want to use a uniform spacing. When you're setting justified, that'll be its own separate thing. But just with poetry, you just want to, the first piece of advice I think is just pick one. Again, pick one, print with it, see how it looks, think about it. For those of you coming from a digital design environment, when you have absolutely regular spacing, whatever that regular spacing is, it will be kind of a shock to see. Because working in a digital design environment where InDesign or even Microsoft Word makes all kinds of arbitrary and continuous decisions about spaces between words, you just don't realize what rigid spacing really looks like. There's a little footnote about digital design and these spaces that I'll get to in a second. So part of what my advice then is pick one and stick with it and see how it looks. That's, I think, good advice, is to just experiment with it, play around with it. Now, there is a history to these spaces. Before 1900, the 3 to M space, which is the thickest of the thin spaces, getting it in focus, was the traditional standard word space. All right? Now, there's something that goes with that. It also used to be, before 1900, roughly, the M quad was used after every period in straight form composition, just prose composition. Probably many of you are familiar with the 2 spaces after a period debate. Anna's shaking her head. I'm resisting. I'm not going to tell the whole thing. But many of you are familiar with the 2 spaces after a period. Yeah, just nod if you're familiar with that in typing, right? Well, there's a whole history there, but basically in 19th century and pre-19th century typesetting, it was standard to set this space after every period. And the typewriter was invented in the 1840s. And as a consequence, when they wanted to replicate what they saw as standard typography, which it was in 1840, they just hit that space bar twice to create that look of that extra gap after the period. Now, of course, as we all know, or most of us probably know, typewriter typography and traditional typography are really different and have diverged in a wide variety of ways. And the two spaces after a period thing is this weird hangover from a totally different design environment, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's where it came from, was just this nice big wide gap. Now, if you wanted to be really precise about it, actually, technically, of course, it would take 3 spaces, right? Because it's a 3 to M space that's the traditional word space. And so at the end of every line, there were 3 of those word spaces after the period. So if you wanted to be super technical with somebody who was getting up on you about typewriter technique, you should tell them, no, really, it should be 3. But, you know, carriage returns, it's all kind of different, doesn't really matter. But what happened is that standard, the M at the end of the period standard, along with the 3 to M space standard, made 18th and 19th century typesetting what we would think of as very loose, right? The tracking on those lines was very open. And the consequence is that as you were setting your lines, you ended up in circumstances where the spaces between the words were more likely to line up, because every space between every word was really wide. It was that big 3 to M space. And that at the end of every line, there was a great big quad sitting there of white space. And of course, many of you are familiar with rivers in typography, right? Where you have multiple spaces across lines lining up vertically down the text. 19th century typesetting was terribly prone to rivers and also to what was called pigeonholing, where there were so many, a lot of short sentences would end up with a ton of these little quads. And so you'd have all these holes, right? And so if you want to set 19th century style, you can set with the 3 to M space and with an M quad at the end, but you're going to have to be very careful to prevent rivers and pigeonholing. You're going to have to keep shifting your lines back and forth and making all kinds of letter space decisions to make it look good. And so you can find good 19th century typesetting that doesn't look weird, but it still has the wide spaces, but it's pretty rare. If you just pick up a piece of like standard commercial fiction from like 1850, it's really kind of weird to look at. The typesetting for us feels very open, almost like a net. It was William Morris who in 1883 went to the first arts and crafts exhibition, where his friend Emery Walker gave a presentation on the 15th century books. So Emery Walker was a photo engraver, and he went to the British Library and took pictures of all the books by Jensen and Aldus Manutius and all the great printers from the 15th century. And he basically put on a PowerPoint presentation in 1883, a magic lantern slide presentation. And it was the first time that regular printers had ever seen these books, these very old books from the very beginning of printing. And William Morris leaned over to his wife and he said, there has never been a beautiful book printed in England in the last 300 years. Because he realized that these early books, now the early books predate these fine distinctions between spaces, and as a rule, their spacing was really tight, really narrow. And so the early books had these very dense black columns of text. And so when William Morris saw those books, he's like, oh man, because William Morris was a total medievalist nut. And he's like, I want my books to look like that. And that's literally like just that moment, his eyes got big and he leaned over to May and he's like, these are awesome. That's like where the Kelmscott press comes from. And the Kelmscott press Morris was very obsessive. He set the 5 to M space as his standard at the Kelmscott press. Now, in 20th century typesetting in England and in America, we weren't quite as crazy as Morris, and we picked the 4 to M space as our standard. And William Morris never talked about this, but all of his typesetting immediately dropped the M quad after sentences. And implicitly, the designers who looked at Morris, right, the Doves Press, the Shakespeare Press, the Fine Book Presses, Hogarth Press even, although if you look at early Hogarth Press, I don't think Virginia Woolf quite knew what she was doing, and so there's a lot of like weirdness going on. But early 20th century modernist printers dropped these spacing conventions and basically tightened everything up. And most of them didn't quite know why. I can actually share with you a 1918 article from the Monotype Recorder where they talk through this change in spacing, where they're basically like, I guess the kids like it. It's like a very funny little article where they're like not quite sure why this change has happened because they're just printers and they're just doing what they're doing and they're not paying attention to history. But Morris was so influential that all the printers around him started doing what he was doing, and some big commercial presses started doing what he was doing. And so over the beginning of the 20th century, the spacing convention changes. In England, it holds on to the 1950s, but in America, it's pretty much all the way changed by 1920. And so, you know, I'm trying not to do the long version of this, Hannah. We've now gone to the 5-dam space. And the 5-dam space, if you set that between your words, you'll find that it looks more like what you expect when you print. Now, again, you're going to end up with a case that's going to have a jumble of spaces. You're going to have to go in there and sort them using your M quad as your measure and just kind of eyeballing them. I'm to a point now where I can just look in the case and say, yeah, that's a 3, that's a 4, and that's a 5. I have a pretty good eye for it. I've been touching them and setting with them for a long time. But after all of that, it's also worth saying, don't worry about it. Like, if you just use the spaces that are in your case in whatever jumble they're in, and you just start setting, you'll get some irregularities in the spaces between the words. But as you get started, it's more important to just get experience with the case and getting typeset and getting some projects done than getting super obsessive. Like there is a deep tradition and a good story to tell about how the spaces are used. And if you want to make a learned judgment about how to use the spaces, like you can do that. But also, like, don't freak out. With my students, I say, don't use this guy. Try not to use the nut, and just get these guys in there, and you'll probably be fine. You probably won't notice it. I mean, again, like if you're a graphic designer, you'll notice it. But if you're just getting started, as my therapist says, forgive yourself. Like let yourself just kind of do the thing.
As a new letterpress person, I feel like that's so freeing to hear you say. Because it feels like there are so many moving parts to pay attention to and to have to get right. So it's nice to know just to explore the craft is sometimes okay.
Well, yeah, and it's like I want you to have both of those things in your mind. In my head, I've always got the impatient 10-year-old in my head, but the more printers I meet, and the more opinions I run into, I try to hold. It's like I have a fictitious old man in my head. The old man. I always think about the old man. Like what would the old guy think? And that's where I'm like, well, what does William Morris think? And that's where I read and I study and I look at all the old printers and I try to get. I spend a lot of time in our university special collections library. I spend time with my Jensen books. I spend time with the Aldous Manutius books. I study them. I look at them. I try to think about like, what would the old guy do? It's always good to like build the old guy in your head, whoever that might be. Like to build that kind of historic and traditional and rule-based like knowledge, like to develop that consciousness. But always to be ready to tell them to just get the fuck out of there. Just shut up, go away. Because sometimes you just want to get a project done. And sometimes you want to see and think things that the old guys couldn't see or think. And obviously we live in a different world and we have a different way of being. So I don't know, be of two minds. I'm always of two minds about everything, and it's served me well. In addition, I'm out of frame now because I'm picking up what I dropped. So in addition to those spaces, you're going to run into these guys. You got coppers. Actually, no, this is a brass. This little piggy is a brass. This little piggy is a copper. By and large, the brasses are a little bit thicker than the coppers, and the brasses are a bit sturdier than the coppers. You'll be able to tell. You'll be able to tell when you see them. Right now in this light, it's a little bit hard to distinguish them, but the coppers are lighter, and obviously they're a little bit dark. They're lighter in weight and darker in color. I realize that wasn't very clear, and they're easier to bend. But for these, you can use them for letter spacing. So if you are setting, say you're not setting a line of poetry, but you're setting a business card. If you're setting a business card, you're going to want to use these to really precisely space out the name of that business so that it sits on the line in the exact increment that you want it to sit. Now, again, you can set solid. You can just set your business, the name of your business, just letter by letter by letter. You don't have to letter space. This is, again, the old guy talking. Like, you can use these to really precisely letter space. And there's some good textbooks that I've read from the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, that talk about the aesthetic decisions that go into letter spacing business names on stationery and things like that. And that's what these are for. In addition to using these for letter spacing, you can also use these to finely gradate your word spacing. So if you think the 3 to M, 4 to M, 5 to M spacing decision is super anal, you have not met the copper brass debate in spacing. Again, I'm setting poetry, and so poetry's ragged right? It's just left justified. The line runs all the way to the end. And so using a uniform spacing in that that's fine. You can make some fine gradated spacing decisions if you want certain letters to sit closer to other letters, the beginnings and ends of words, for aesthetic reasons. But if you're setting justified, that is de rigueur in letterpress typesetting for prose. If you're setting justified, you need these.
You also need paper.
I'm going to pause on that. Do people know what I mean by justified typesetting? Okay. And again, it's like in InDesign, you click a button. And InDesign it does a bunch of math and shit, and it's done. And what it means is that the lines all start and end directly on those boundaries, right? Whatever lines you set as the boundaries of the text, there's a letter at the beginning of the line and there's a letter at the end of the line, and it carries through. You have to mechanically do that in letterpress typesetting, right? Let me finish this line and I'll show you what it looks like ragged, and then I'll show you a very bad justification job on it. Okay? That makes sense? All right, so I'm back to my setting. My kids, I can hear them arguing upstairs. All right, so I'm setting H, E, A. You can't even see me right now, can you? Because I didn't flip the camera.
Nope.
I see vegetable written.
Yeah, that's don't worry about it. Hold on a second. I'll be over there in a second. I'm here.
Fritz, while you're doing that, William had recommended instead of the brass or the coppers that some old printers use paper. Have you ever successfully?
Not instead of, in addition to.
Oh, in addition to, pardon.
Yeah, it's more flexible, and depending on the thickness of your paper, I justify a lot of stuff. And
do you?
Justify getting paper.
And it can help tighten up lockups in the chase also, little paper in there.
As old guys.
Yeah, and then you're in a position of sometimes doing caliper measurements on the paper, different thicknesses of paper. Do you do that?
Yes.
All the time.
Yep. And you need special calipers too.
Oh. Yeah, I don't.
Kelsey just mentioned that she keeps some vellum in her for her finicky lockups. So sounds like we all use different thicknesses.
Yeah, and to that point, it's like this gets back to that, like everything could have been a life's work. I've shown you the basics, and I just want to pause on it. It's like you have type, you have a type stick, you have leading, you have spaces. You have to think about your measure, and you have to set the line to that measure, however that measure plays out. And those are the basics. And you can actually get very far on just that information. Like setting aside the particulars of individual widths of spacing, and setting aside the particulars of like whether you use a uniform spacing or use different kinds of spacing between different kinds of words. It's like there's so much you can add on to those skills. But if you just get in there and you get your stick and you start setting and you get started in that way, you can get quite far. You can build you could build a business around that. Now, there's a lot of finicky problems that knowing this other stuff can solve. And so you can get frustrated sometimes because if you forget some of those extra pieces of, if you forget what the old man's saying all the time, you forget all that historical information, you can paint yourself into some corners. And like when you're talking about paper as a spacing material in order to like fine tune your lockup, like, yeah, that's a different video. Like that's its own interesting, complicated process. Like the uses of paper in lockups, there's a lot of different things you can do with them, not just between spaces, but in other places too. Totally agree. But it's also worth remembering that like 12-year-olds did this. and you always have to remember that it's like the bar for entry is low, the bar for expertise is almost infinite. Like it's a lifetime, it's a wonderful, Ezra Klein actually talks about finite and infinite games. Like tic-tac-toe is a finite game. That's why you don't play it anymore, because you figured out how it goes. But typesetting is an infinite game. Typesetting is a game, and I can see William nodding. Typesetting is a game which you can just sink into it, and you can devote yourself to it. You can really love it. I
printer's math.
Oh God, yeah. Like you can be much more precise about like which type you want to choose because of how it's gonna set not in one page but over 10 pages, because you can calculate out where the line is going to end based on the number of words and the width of each character. I have a little textbook from 1918 called Printer's Arithmetic that does those calculations. It's got a bunch of charts in it, and you can just be like, I'm going to set in century, from 1880 or whatever, and it'll tell you, well, it's going to tail off after 12 pages if you set 400 words, if you set 4,000 words or whatever. But you can also get into it so you can learn that stuff. I knew a printer once who was so precise about his letter spacing that he would kern a period if he needed to.
Wow.
He would take that individual period and he would go over to his type saw, and he would, with a tiny little pair of tweezers and a little bit of wood, he would hold it and he would just shave off just microns of metal to get that period to set in. Yeah, it's a life's work. You really could. It's wonderful.
It's visual.
Yes, William?
I was going to say it's visual. You got to look at it. You got to look right.
Yeah. All right. So, well, here I'm going to flip my screen around so I can show you this line. Again, talking about spacing. So, let's see here. I don't know which way is best. Okay, so you can see that the line ends, that the letters end before the line ends, right? And we've got all of that spacing at the end of the line. And right now I have that spacing measured out using pretty much just double M quads. But just to clarify this idea of justification, if we were to justify this poem, and again, I'm not recommending we should, but if we were to justify the poem, the basic idea is all that spacing at the end of the line needs to go in the line. That's the idea of justification. And I'll do it real quickly. In fact, I'll flip it around again here. And I will just dump my spaces at the end into the middle, it's obviously with this very short line and this extra measure, it's going to mean there's going to be these huge gaps between the words. But the idea is that, and when I'm teaching my students this, is that, you know, you're going to want initially to set things ragged right, because ragged right is conceptually very easy to set. And that's a good starting place. But eventually you're going to want to justify your line, and conceptually the way to think about it before you get into it is just say, yeah, I'm going to take all that spaces, I'm going to put them in the middle, and it'll, I think doing it badly like this can be instructive. Sorry, because as you're setting type, you're going to want to think, if you're justifying, you're going to want to think ahead. Okay, so I'm going to flip my thing around again and show you my justified line. Looks like a kid who's lost a lot of teeth in a fight. But the idea is again, you can see there's a letter on each end, and that's a justified line. In fact, I wonder, have you ever seen Microsoft Word do this? Mm-hmm. If you click justified and the tracking is bad or something like that, and you've got a narrow column and it's just like, oh, this last line, just pushing it all out, right? So that's bad justification. But the idea then is if this had more, if the measure were shorter, right? If the measure were shorter, or if there were more words in the line, then you understand why having all of those different spaces becomes useful in justification, because it allows you to make decisions about where you want to put more or less space, right? That's the big key. Justification is another one where it's like my recommendation for everybody would be, if you're getting started typesetting, set a poem, set it ragged right, and have that be your first project. But then your second project should be prose, and you should try to justify it. Where as you're setting it, you're starting and ending on those letters, and you're having to make decisions about where to drop those spaces, because it's never going to work right. You're never going to be able to end every line perfectly on a letter and have perfectly uniform spacing throughout the line. And there's a bunch of different decisions. You know, this is the H and J problem you're going to have even in InDesign, hyphenating and justifying. You're going to have to decide whether to break words up at the end of the line, but you're also going to have to decide some of these words are going to have more space between them than other words, and how do I make those decisions? And again, I just recommend for everybody, there are traditional historic answers to that question, but probably the first thing to do is, if it's a hobby project, just run it through and see how the spacing looks, print it, and then go back and do it again. Just keep doing it until it arrives at a practice that pleases you. You know, the basic advice people, I think, historically give is that if at the end or beginning of a particular word, if the letter form is small, then it can tolerate less space between the words. Does that make sense? So if a word begins with I, and it's set right next to a word that ended with I, the letter I is very small in its glyph space. So it already has a lot of extra white space around it. I'm going to flip this back around because I'm flopping my hands now. And that extra white space can be given to the word space. So you can use a 5 to M space between a word that ends with I and a word that starts with I. But if you've got a word that, say, one word ends with an H and the next word begins with a Y, those have ascenders and descenders, right? So they're taking up more of their glyph space white space. Or say a word begins with a capital O, like Oregon, and then the word before it was, ends with a T, right? You've got those letters that are taking up that space. And so they need more space between them. And so as you're justifying a line, right, the spaces that are surrounded by big letters need more space between them. And the spaces that are surrounded by small letters need less space between them. And so if you've got a long line that you're justifying and you need to be able to put 3 damn spaces in some of the spaces and 4 damn spaces in the other spaces, that's how you would make your decision. Now, that's definitely true in justification, but even when you're setting poetry, you might find that it's more pleasing to do those kinds of distinctions, make those kinds of distinctions. But again, when you're starting, I would say ragged right, poetry, use 1 space if you can, and just kind of get a feel for it. All right. I've gone on for a little bit here. Those are the basics of typesetting. Before I go any further, I have one other thing I wanted to show you guys, but before I go any further, are there any questions, or how are we doing? Is this going all right? Thanks, Will.
Great. I don't know if you're going to cover it next, and this may be obvious to everyone else, but I cannot figure out how to get the type cleanly off of the typesetting tool and like into my to be able to set it.
Very good
How do you get the
demonstration.
type from the tool into your lockup without it like falling all over the place?
Okay, so let me move my camera.
I hope
But you say you need.
I don't know. I've just had a number of disasters where I've tried to move it from the typesetting tool onto my lockup, and I've not been successful.
Okay. I will try not to dump this type while I'm getting my thing set up here. Oh, I have a type mold too. I could talk about a type mold. Okay, so this is not really a stone, but it's a good smooth surface. All right, so I'm gonna, first of all, here's the big risk, I'm gonna set it flat. So when you set it flat, already you're gonna end up in a situation where things might start toppling over. Can you guys hear my kids arguing upstairs?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Hey, Sarah. I think that quieted them down. It's quarantine life, everybody. Okay. So here's a couple recommendations I would make before I do anything else. When I set a line like this, even though this is justified right now, I actually would do one other thing, and Anna knows this very well. I recommend that people set, this is totally not historical, but this is years of experience with students. Set an M quad at the beginning and end of each line, and treat the M quad as the end of the measure. Because if you set M quads at the beginning and ending of every line, your measure is just 2, well, if it's 12 point, it's 2 pica, but it's around 2 picas shorter. I mean, obviously, if you're setting a big type, but whatever. It's uniform, and it will create that same column of text. But the M quad, I mean, if you're really wanting training wheels, set with double M's, right? You know, this is a double M. It's double the thickness of an M quad. If you set one of those at either end of your line, then you're going to keep that line stable. Because again, this goes back to like one of my basic principles. I am not George the Velocipede Ahrensberg. I am not a 19th century typesetter who's been doing this for 40 years, right? And I'm only 52. The hand skills that go into moving type around take time to develop, and having these set at the end of each line can be useful because they keep the line upright, right? Because one of the big problems people have when they're moving type out of the stick is, say you end the line on an L. That L is very thin, and it has a tendency to want to just drop out while you're moving the stick, while you're moving the type. And so having an M quad or a double M at the end of each line can just keep things stable. And especially if you're a new typesetter, if one thing starts to fall, you can get kind of panicked, and then the whole thing falls apart. And so having this bit of stabilization can really keep things going. But even without that, the biggest thing is having good pressure on either end of the stick, having the stick flat on your surface, and then just sliding forward. And as I move the line off the stick, and I'm holding up here, and then my middle fingers come down and support on either side. And then if I've got pressure from the bottom, pressure from the top, and from both sides, then I can slide it into the position I need to. And in fact, because I'm setting with thick leading in this case, I have good support on both sides that I can just leave it like that. Now that's only one line of type, and one line of type is usually one of the least stable forms. With multiple lines of type, again, it's even more stable. You should be good to go. But it's going to be the edges of the edge boundaries of the type form that are going to be the most unstable. That's where setting with M quads on either end can be really helpful. Obviously, once it's out off the stick, then you might want to tie it up with string. That's a traditional technique. But that, by the way, is one of those skills that I've never particularly developed. Anna, Anna's much better at it than I am. For me, if I'm going to leave a form just kind of sitting, I will just set. See, and a letter just fell over. Third piece of advice is just never panic. Panicking will cause more destruction than anything. But I just set some stuff around it. I've got my letter here, and I'm going to pick it up. All right. See, that's a lowercase I, which is exactly why setting with an M quad would be beneficial there. So if I'm walking away from that to go get something else, I've just got some blocks sitting around it. It's fine. And I can come back to it then and do my lockup. But that's how you slide it off your stick. It's just about having pressure from all your directions and then being careful about it.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
I hope so. The only other thing I was going to show you, and it won't take very much, is just setting from stick. And it's actually apropos the question of like how to carefully move things off the stick. Let me do this. So I'm going to transfer this form now. And now you get to watch me dump the form. I'm sure I'm going to screw it up. Ha! It fell. Okay. So stick is the historic typesetting technique. But actually in practice, I don't often set to stick because again, that's a jumbled mess, but it's okay because I'm not actually using it. I set to galley, which is what's going on there. I set to galley where I use this piece of wood on the bottom, different lengths of it to set my measure. And then these two pieces of wood on either side are the sides of that space created by the stick, right? You have to remember that setting to stick was a technique for people who were typesetting at 25 to 35 characters per minute in an industrial environment where they're setting for 10 hours a day. They're filling up that stick at that speed. They're filling up that stick several times an hour, right? And then they're transferring the material off that stick onto a galley and building up a form, right? And sometimes they'll have people in the shop who are like helping move things around. They've got an imposition guy at the stone who's moving big blocks of text around. And so the speed at which they're operating and the number of people doing the work is so much different from how we're operating that the stick typesetting method, while a good historic tradition and can in some cases be an advantageous way to set, isn't the only or necessarily always the best way to set. When I'm working with students, I like to set up a galley tray like this with wood block edges and my measures set by wood on the bottom. And then I start, I set my leading on top of the wood and then I start setting, because it means that it's basically already moved off the stick, right? It's in a stable space. If a student sits down and sets on the galley and they have to go to the bathroom all of a sudden and they're in the middle of a line, they don't have to find a weird place to set their stick. They don't have to hand it to anybody. They just get up and they walk away. And whatever speed they're setting at, it's there. And they can build, and here I'll move you again. So this is most of my Longfellow poems. And I'm just setting it directly in the galley. Because then I can build the whole project up in the galley. And I don't have to move it. I mean, ultimately, I will still have to move it. Like if I were to print it on a Vandercook or a flatbed press, printing from the galley, obviously it's already done. I just need to support it. I just need to do a little bit of lockup on it in the galley, and I'm ready to go. If I want to print it on my CNP, I will have to lock it up in a chase. I will have to move it off the galley, but I won't have had to move stanza by stanza off the stick onto the galley and then build it up on the galley and then move it from the galley onto the stone and do the lockup. I've taken the stick out of the equation, and I've taken some of that uncertainty out of the equation. Now, the benefit of the stick is that its left and right edges are rigid. Once you lock them down, they're locked down. And so if you're justifying your line very precisely, having those locked boundaries can be very helpful. So the stick is very useful. But for me, I'm setting ragged right, and I have a pretty good eye for keeping my edges clean and lined up. I don't have any problem with it. So setting the galley, showing you how to do typesetting with the stick is a good way to introduce you to it. It's also very mobile, but setting the galley is the way that I often do it when I'm doing longer projects like this. Because for me, I'll be sitting down here 20 minutes. Maybe I'll pick at this for 20 minutes and I'll do part of a line, and then there'll be something upstairs, kid needs something, whatever. I run upstairs, I take care of it, and then and it just sits here. And frankly, given my schedule, I've been setting this poem now for about 18 months. So I apologize to everybody. I've done a lot of projects in the interim of setting this poem. Usually my personal projects get shunted to the side. And so having it set on a galley to me is priceless, because if I were setting it on stick and I were stuck in the middle of it on a stick, it's so much more of a pain. All right, that's, there you go. Hour and a half. That's what I've got on typesetting. Like I said, I've got other stuff here, and I can answer questions, but I don't want to hold anybody any longer than this. Probably it was too long for everybody already.
I think that's so wonderful. Thank you so much, Fritz. You guys take yourself off of mute. Does anybody have any questions?
I just don't want it to echo too much when everyone comes off mute. But Fritz, for what it's worth, I've been keeping up with the chat, and most everyone has responded that they love your historical stories, which is totally why I checked into this meeting. So I want you to know that.
That's kind. I can't see the chat, so I'm learning a lot about Zoom on my iPad. That's what I'm learning about right now.
Fritz, I think this has been so valuable, for at least I can speak for myself as a new printer. Thank you very, very much for all the time today.
Well, thank you for setting it up. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys that were on, we'll do, Fritz, there was also a request in the chat to do a running list of the books that you've recommended. So I know, mind blown, right?
Obviously me, so I can coordinate that with you, Fritz, if you want.
Yeah.
I'm interested too.
Yeah, maybe Anna and I will put together a show notes to post on Letterpress on Facebook.
That would be incredible.
Helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be
okay.
Great. So I'll save the recording and I'll share it with you first, Fritz, and then a couple of requests to post it more publicly, maybe on the Facebook page, so we can talk about the logistics of that and get your permission. For those of you guys that are interested in continuing other opportunities like this, I'm working on getting together a make ready video. So somebody to show us how to do make ready, and I'm hoping that can happen in the next week or so. And then I know the questions that I have, but I would love more importantly to hear about the questions that you guys have and what you're interested in seeing. And if you could be a resource and a host like Fritz did today, or you know someone that could serve as a host, I think this is such a fantastic learning opportunity for the community that I'd like to keep it going where we could. But while we have you, thank you so much, Fritz. It's really been a joy to spend the last hour or so with you. I appreciate it.
Last hour or so, that's typical.
Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure. It has been a real pleasure. I enjoyed sharing that with you guys, and thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fritz. It was great looking at your basement ceiling there.
Yeah.
That was really awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, guys, we'll see you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.